Alright gang, here it is. Time for a controversial subject. It's mayonnaise. I don't know anything that divides people as much as mayonnaise. Some people can't get enough of it. Slather it on sandwiches, on fries, on basically anything you can think of. They're really drawn to that unctuous, creamy taste of mayonnaise. But for other people, mayonnaise is anathema. It disgusts them, it sickens them. It's something that they can't even think about without getting shivers down their spine. Mayonnaise calls up something deep and dark inside them. But mayonnaise is also a really important foundational sauce, and that's one of the things we're going to talk about today. We don't exactly know where mayonnaise comes from. Some people think that the name is a bastardization of the town of Bayonne. Other people attribute it to different counts or different French generals. There's a lot of stories around mayonnaise. But one thing we do know is that around 150 years ago, Auguste Escoffier, the founder of modern French cuisine, helped to codify the recipe for mayonnaise. It might not even surprise you to know that today in France there's a specific code of standards that regulates what can actually be called mayonnaise. Oil, egg yolk, vinegar, salt, and pepper. That's it. There are some other controversial ingredients, and we'll talk about them in a minute. Mayonnaise is one of the foundational mother sauces of French cuisines, along other sauces that you probably haven't heard of, like velouté, and some that you have heard of, like hollandaise, which you probably have had on eggs benedict before. So today I thought we could make some mayonnaise, and we could see how much better or maybe worse that mayonnaise is from the ones you get in a jar of Hellmann's or your other leading brand of mayonnaise. I don't think there are any other leading brands of mayonnaise. The basic preparation is really simple. It's just an emulsion of fat droplets swirling around, held together in suspended animation. First you start out with egg yolk. Then you've got just a little bit of vinegar here. I'm using apple cider vinegar, but you could probably use champagne vinegar or even just a plain white vinegar. Then I've got 150 milliliters of good olive oil. I've got about 1/4 teaspoon of Maldon sea salt. I've got 1/4 teaspoon of pepper, and here we have the most controversial ingredient, mustard. I'm something of a mustard freak, so I'm going to include mustard in my recipe, but I'll have you know that this does violate the convention of the international standards for mayonnaise. But some French chefs are willing to countenance it in certain hotel or restaurant preparations. We'll go for it. And I want to point out that I thought long and hard about using this fantastic Schwerte Sennmühle mustard from Germany, but instead I'm going to stick a little bit with tradition, and I'm going to instead use Edmund Fellow's fantastic tarragon mustard. If you haven't tried it, pick it up. So we'll start out with the basics. We're going to take a bowl and we're going to put the egg yolk inside it. Then we'll take that 1/2 tablespoon of vinegar, put it in there. We'll add the salt and the pepper. And purists might not want to watch right now, but this is also the point where we include the mustard. Oh man, look at that. And now we're going to whisk it all together. Already kind of beautiful. Just a guy making some mayonnaise. I think it's happening, guys. It's taking shape. This is it. We are really whisking now. Alright, I've been beating for a while. No one said that mayonnaise was going to be easy. But it is going to be good, and the only thing you can do to really mess up your mayonnaise is to add too much oil at once, which is going to break that emulsion. This is it. I've done it. I've created mayonnaise. I feel like Walter White in the beginning of the first season of Breaking Bad. This is absolutely incredible. It was pretty good. The only way it could be even better is if I went full-on French breakfast with this, which is why I've got some radishes. C'est très bon. Turns out I couldn't really make tortillas, but as it happens, I've mastered one of the French mother sauces. There's a lot more to go. We're gonna get back to those mother sauces in just a minute. But for now, I think I'm gonna finish breakfast, or as I call it now, petit déjeuner. À bientôt. Hey everyone, I'm Benjamin Siegel, and welcome back to Taste, Culture, and Power. When I say French food, you can probably call to mind a couple of images of what exactly it is. And when I say Italian food, you can probably do the exact same thing. Same goes with Chinese food or Indian food. There's a really vast range of cultural images that we have for every type of cuisine. And there's kind of a simple logic that goes on in our brains. Wherever you've got a nation, you've got a national cuisine, the cuisine that goes along with that country. But as you're probably guessing, the story is a little more complicated than that. And today we're going to unpack just what we mean when we say a national cuisine, where that comes from, and how the stories of nationalism and nation building and cuisine are all tied up together. We're going to start off in Europe before we move on to some case studies from Latin America, and then we'll turn our attention briefly to some similar developments in Asia. As we do this, keep in mind some of the images that you just called up to mind when I talked about those different sorts of national cuisines, and let's see if we can both historicize them and make them a little more complicated. Let's start off with a really simple question. What is nationalism? Throughout the modern world, we've seen one predominant form of political organization rise up above all others, and that, of course, is the nation. There's also the empire, which is an outgrowth of the nation, and we're going to talk about that next time. Certainly, people have loved the places they're from for as long as recorded human history. But the idea of a nation, the idea of a community of people glued together by a common culture and history, didn't really come together until around the 18th century. Nationalism, or the ideology that came up around this time, was the idea that a given nation, no matter how you thought about it or drew boundaries around it, should be able to govern itself as well. Nationalism in Europe, in the Americas, in Asia, and elsewhere was usually a reactionary project. It came about as people were re-envisioning the sorts of communities they belonged to against the backdrop of political transformations, liberating themselves from particular rulers or political systems, or drawing a line between one community and the other. Nationalism always took work. Many subjects of what would later become nations spoke different languages or dialects. They had their own customs and different religious traditions. And all of those different cultural forms had to be brought together under one legitimate-seeming roof, and then had to be made to be seen as ancient with old mythological origins. The tools used to make those myths and the ideas of a shared culture were generally new ones. Schools, armies, mass media, all of these tools had to be conscripted in the service of making these new nations. But no tool, I think, was quite as powerful as the idea of national cuisines, which were cast as representative of or constituent of new nations themselves. So as we go forward, I'm going to ask you whether there really is any such thing as Italian food or French food or Chinese food, or whether, as I tend to think, these cuisines were really part of a big 19th century project of making new nations by bringing together all sorts of regional foods and shutting out others. Let's dive in. Let's begin with France. A little bit earlier, I talked about the notion of a moral economy in France during the Revolution. And it was during that revolution, while getting rid of France's monarchy, that France's court cuisine was nationalized. Our story has to start with the guillotine, and the execution of some of France's aristocracy. Before the revolution, some accounts hold, those aristocrats had employed chefs who prepared meals in lavish residences or in the halls of the palace at Versailles. But after France's monarchy was turned out, those chefs began looking for new employment, and they started opening new places for the public to eat. The term restaurant had already been used at this point. It was a place for travelers to stop and stay and fill up, usually with a soup or a beverage, which gave the institution its name. But it was in this moment that the restaurant became something else, became a place for the bourgeoisie or the ascendant upper middle class to both enjoy themselves and to show new ideas of their taste and their refinement in a sort of public space. There was a new ethos and concept that went along with this new institution, almost a philosophy really, and that was the notion of gastronomy. Gastronomy was a set of rules, or maybe accurately codes or guidelines for proper eating. It was a way for people to demonstrate their refinement even outside of the aristocratic court. It was a little more democratic, although it still had at its heart ideas of taste and refinement. You of course had to have some money to eat in a restaurant, but also knowledge of the different types of food being served. In other words, the restaurant was a way of creating new social distinctions forced by class, though not by birth. The idea of France as a site where food had been elevated to an art traveled really quickly. In Europe and around the world, there were new positions for French chefs and a new desire to import French food and wine. But even in France, this wasn't a given. It was an idea that was produced and taught to the French themselves, who initially didn't even see themselves as French, but for a long time as members of a given region before members of a nation. Media and print played a big role in this creation. French readers in the 19th century could read a new journal published by Alexandre Grimaud de la Reynière called The Gourmand, which outlined the finest restaurants and purveyors of food and wine. There were new cookbooks that professionalized the kitchen and helped to establish codes of conduct and standardization for French haute cuisine. Even fiction played a little bit of a role in this story. The great French novelist Honoré set many of his books in Parisian restaurants, helping to convey ideas of taste and refinement to a new reading public. But the most important figure in this moment was Anselme Brillat-Savarin, a lawyer and politician who later would become known as the father of French gastronomy. He had a saying, "Animals feed and man eats, but only the intelligent man knows how to eat." In 1826, Brillat-Savarin published a book called The Physiology of Taste. This was a big, wordy book of essays that outlined the pleasures of the table, and it framed them as something of a science. He commended the merits of truffles and rare wines, but he also suggested that taste was something that could be appreciated by the French public at very different budgets. He said, "My book is not written for the great houses alone." But the idea of a universalizing ethic of gastronomy also wasn't quite honest. French gastronomy required that a person take on the trappings of Parisian culture in particular, and learn a whole suite of different terms and honorifics, from titles for compound butters to different historical changes in French cuisine itself. There was an uneven mix-and-match quality to French gastronomy. There were provincial dishes like faisan that were brought into the national cuisine, and there was also the inclusion of dishes like fish dumplings à la lyonnaise, though they weren't like anything being actually cooked in Lyon at the time. French cuisine even assimilated certain foreign dishes into its repertoire. It included things like hollandaise sauce or English turtle soup, which became French. As French gastronomy advanced, it also became more and more codified. And the most important figure in the story was Georges Auguste Escoffier, who was a French chef who became known as the Roi des Cuisiniers et le Cuisinier des Rois, the king of chefs and the chef of kings. Escoffier took 5 well-known French sauces and worked to codify their recipes, some of which you know and others of which you probably don't. Maybe most familiar to you is something like hollandaise sauce, made of eggs and butter and lemon. You might have had it over something like eggs benedict or just simply over asparagus. There's a classic white sauce called béchamel, which is made of flour and butter and milk, salt and pepper, and sometimes a little bit of nutmeg. Any classic macaroni and cheese or lasagna makes extensive use of a good béchamel. The third of the really familiar sauces is just a simple tomato sauce, made with oregano and basil, onions and garlic. Escoffier generally started it with pork belly and a roux at the beginning. The last 2 of Escoffier's sauces aren't that famous today. They're not used as often. The 4th sauce is called velouté. It's a silky, light sauce that's a little like béchamel, but instead of milk you use a kind of unclarified bone stock. And the last of these sauces is called espagnole, or Spanish sauce, though it's not really Spanish at all. It's a dark sauce that's made with stock, vegetables, brown sugar, and usually tomatoes. Those sauces represent the real codification of French haute cuisine, and students at cooking schools today still learn all of those basic sauces. But briefly, let's go back to the restaurants, which in the 19th century served as a real-world theater for playing out ideas of gastronomy and taste. One of the most distinct qualities of restaurants is rather than the ordered courses of aristocratic palaces, they offered individual servings that you could select à la carte or from the menu. They came to you as an individual and not on big shared platters. It'd be a long time before family-style meals came into vogue again in Western restaurants. Restaurants were also a kind of place that was neither private or fully public, kind of in between. There were chambers that you could book to eat, but also for romance. It was kind of a semi-intimate space. It wasn't easy to go to a restaurant. You needed fluency or at least some kind of proficiency in their basic idioms. But for those who were initiated, it was a space where you could take on new social engagements or opportunities. Eventually, the qualities that made restaurants so appealing also trickled down to working-class venues. Cafes were first seen as places that were downmarket. They were where drunk men or disreputable women went.
but eventually they became a more respectable place for working men and in time their families to go to. Balzac described them as the parliament of the people, and of course we enjoy the informality of cafes today. The food and wines that you got at a Parisian cafe weren't the same, they weren't as good as the ones you got in top Parisian restaurants. But railroad transportation and other new technologies helped them serve a variety of good foods. The standards varied, but generally cafe customers could eat really well, even if a lot of the time they were actually just eating the leftovers from things served at top Parisian restaurants. Institutions like the cafe and the restaurant and the rise of new consumer markets meant drawing disparate producers into a national economy. Often this was a really complicated process, and peasant producers fought really hard to get the best terms for their products. We can see this all in one item that we're probably very familiar with. Wines had enjoyed international reputations even as far back as the ancient Mediterranean. But in the 19th century, they were marketed by producers in new and innovative ways. Vintners began to wax poetic about the impact that soil, climate, even the attitude or the soul of the winemaker had on a given wine, well beyond just the simple qualities of whatever grape was being grown. They had a word for this particular collection of qualities. They called it terroir, the taste of a place itself. This wasn't just a kind of loose aesthetic talk, it wasn't just pie in the sky, but it frequently carried the weight of the law behind it. Producers of one particular sparkling wine in the region of Champagne began to insist that only wine produced in that region could carry that name. But eventually, industrial firms like Moet et Chandon began to import grapes and then produce the wine in Champagne, so those definitions became kind of unclear. This mixed system existed until around 1911, when the farmers in Champagne rose up in armed rebellion, and they forced the winehouses to limit the terms to wines produced with grapes grown in the region itself. Over the next several decades, the idea of an appellé, or a certified designation of origin, came to be used to certify not only wines, but things like cheese, butters, all other kinds of agricultural products linked to the specific place in which they were produced. There was one group of people who were deeply upset about the rise of French cuisine and its new hegemony across Europe. Maybe it won't surprise you to learn that Italians were outraged by this development. Italian chefs had been trendsetters in Europe since the Renaissance, and Italian chefs had been in demand in palaces across the world for centuries. So why didn't Italians capitalize on these new trends? The answer is that food developments never really take place outside of politics. Italy wasn't united as a nation until relatively late in the 19th century, with unification in 1861. And as a result, the consolidation of Italian food and gastronomy came a little bit later. Italian food reached a high point in 1891 with the publication of this book, Science in the Kitchen and the Art of Eating Well. Its author was an Italian businessman, Pellegrino Artusi, who used the language of science and experimentation to outline what were allegedly the best recipes for national Italian cuisine. La Scienza in Cucina was an incredibly popular book, and most Italian households have a copy today. Historians of Italy argue that this was the book that invented Italian national cuisine, linking polite society with regional characteristics. This isn't a really comprehensive book of Italian cooking. Its focus is on the rich foods of Emilia-Romagna, the birthplace of many familiar pasta dishes, and the simpler foods of Tuscany. For color, there's a couple of Genovese, Sicilian, and Neapolitan dishes also included. But as in France and elsewhere, the 19th century in Italy was a moment when cuisine was called upon to help forge shared ideas of a new nation and national belonging. Let's expand our horizon a bit and look beyond Europe. The same processes of nationalism and nation-building that were riling the European continent were also playing out elsewhere. And the case in Latin America was similar in some ways and different in others. As we've discussed earlier, cuisines in the Americas after the Columbian Exchange were marked by the complex intermingling of old and new. By the 19th century, nationalist sentiments were running high across South and Central America. But there was a real cultural tension between wealthy elites in Latin America, who clung on to European notions of taste and refinement, and the ethnically mixed masses in places like Brazil and Mexico, who resisted that notion that Europe was the font of discernment. This conflict would simmer on until well into the early 20th century. It's possible to see this very clearly in the case of Mexico. There, mestizo or mixed elites proclaimed the wisdom of their putative Aztec and Inca forebears, trying to draw a distinction between themselves and native commoners, while also increasingly tying their identity to European ideas of culture. If you take a look at Mexican cookbooks throughout the 19th century, you get things like Spanish mutton stew, which over time are replaced with dishes that look a little bit European, like beef Chateaubriand. Local foods like tamales, things that you might think of as quintessentially Mexican right now, weren't even included in those cookbooks. Elites denigrated those as unworthy of codification in any kind of official way. This was exemplified in the independence celebrations for Mexico in 1910, when not a single Mexican dish was served in a series of French-style banquets. A similar dynamic played out in Chile, where wealthy planters and businessmen imported wine rootstock from places like Bordeaux in France, setting the stage for a New World wine industry. They also planted Mediterranean crops like olives, drawing cultural linkages between themselves and European ideas of gastronomy. Naturally, in cities like Santiago, the most important restaurants there in the 19th century were French, and elite Chileans went to dinners wearing things like wool frock coats and top hats, again, trying to show themselves as being European in taste. It wasn't just cuisine that was at stake, but ideas about race and civilization itself. In 1897, the Dominican intellectual José Ramón López wrote a book called La Alas, or Food and Race, where he argued that the Caribbean diet, based on plantains, wasn't just unnutritious, but was also keeping the Dominican Republic from becoming a real or modern country. Similarly, the Mexican journalist and science Francisco Bolnes declared that maize was the eternal pacifier of America's indigenous races and the foundation of their refusal to become civilized. The European race of wheat, he said, is the only true progressive one. But things did begin to change over the course of the 19th century. Around the time of the First World War, the Francophile elites of an earlier generation began to lose power to populists who reasserted the value of local Latin American culture. There were some technological changes that helped bring this about. In Mexico, the labor-intensive process of making tortillas by hand was revolutionized by the invention of mechanical tortilla presses. With the creation of tortilla factories, peasants were drawn into the national economy, and at the same time, foods like tamales were recast as being central to Mexican cuisine and identity. Around that same time, Brazilians were undertaking similar cultural campaigns of reassertion. In the 1930s, Brazilians began to celebrate the African and Native American influences in their culture. They began to identify strongly with a new national dish, a feijoada, where the mix of rice and black beans symbolized a new ideal of racial democracy. South America was the last holdout of European culture, but slowly, French cuisine began to fade in capitals like Buenos Aires, Lima, and Santiago. New dishes came to replace these old French banquets, like Argentine churrasco with roast meats, ceviche in Peru, or the mix of chicken, corn, and olives in Chile's pastel de cholco. This was a period when Latin Americans were rediscovering culinary influences and making new radical claims about national belonging. The intersection of food and nation building was different in Asia, where distinct and divergent encounters with Western-style modernity produced different responses in the realm of cuisine. Let's look really briefly at how these encounters played out differently in China, Japan, and Siam, or modern-day Thailand. Foreign foods had been thoroughly integrated in China since early in the Qing dynasty. But while new ingredients were welcome in that dynasty, new kitchen practices generally were not. And even foods like sweet potatoes and corn from the New World were remade into Chinese-style noodles or porridges. Adopting Han court cuisine had been one important way that the foreign Manchu rulers had made themselves legible as legitimate rulers for their subjects, who were a majority Han Chinese. But there really was a jumble of different cuisines and ideas about ethnic origin in late Qing China, so it wasn't really practical to translate elaborate court food rituals into mass culture. So broadly, food doesn't seem to have played such a major role in either the nationalist revolution in China in 1911, nor the communist revolution in 1949. Mao and others would attack an older style of banquet eating as excessive, though even they would occasionally revive those practices for purposes of international diplomacy. But the story was a little bit different in Japan after its opening in the middle of the 19th century. Tokugawa Japan was indeed isolationist, but in earlier eras, Japan had eagerly imported foreign cultural innovations, particularly from Tang-era China. And reformists in Meiji-era Japan watched what was taking place in Qing China with a lot of concern. They decided that their modern nation-building processes in this period would mean taking on new practices, and food was one of those areas. For much of their modern history, Japanese citizens had avoided eating most mammals, and even fish that appeared to be too meaty or bloody, like tuna. Japanese writers had sometimes declared that Europeans smelled like butter. They were using food as a way of showing difference and contempt. But in 1872, at the height of the Meiji reforms, the Meiji Emperor publicly ate beef in an effort to embody these new processes of Western modernization. Before long, Japanese military rations were including beef as well. And over the last decades of the 19th century, Western-style restaurants began sprouting up in cities, though it really was a Japanese-style stew, beef sukiyaki, that helped popularize beef among the majority of Japanese. These changes were geographically disparate. They were limited to cities at first. In more rural areas, it was a revival of things like soy brewing and the making of other foods with new industrial processes that marked the transformation of Japanese cuisine. And sort of like wine in France, it was rice that proved to be the most important item that Japanese cultivators used to stress the importance of regional identity in a new national cuisine. Rice cultivars and different regional varieties were given a lot of new significance in this period as important markers of regional belonging. In other Asian contexts, food was also being used as a way of consolidating geographically and culturally distinct subjects. This was particularly true in Siam, later-day Thailand, where modernization took the form of centralizing power and building new infrastructure. At the turn of the 20th century, there was a big effort from the imperial court to help consolidate the idea of national belonging through a particular mix of food. South Asian-style curries, Chinese noodles, and more local flavors of fish, coriander, garlic, and black pepper were held out as both court cuisine, but also the food of the commoner. Rustic or peasant food also found its way into court preparations as a symbolic way of linking a distant subject with an everyday citizen. Rustic peasant food also found its way into court preparations as a way of linking the subject with a distant, far-off imperial ruler. This was pretty similar to what was taking place in Vietnam under colonial context, but that's a big subject, and we're going to come back to that next time. So, nationalist cuisines were made and remade in the era of nationalism, but their legacy lives on in the present day, not least in our own ideas about major cuisines and their boundaries. Even in an era with renewed emphasis on local or regional foods, we tend to give a lot of credence to concepts like Italian food or Chinese food. Let's go back to where we started. The 19th century across the world was a time when the process of nationalism was given a hand by the consolidation of new national cuisines. These cuisines were, in a matter of speaking, artificial. They advanced new ideologies and new affinities, and they drew creatively upon peasant traditions, politics, and ideas about refinement and taste. Together, they helped spur on the idea of a nation that had always existed, even when food traditions themselves were new and divided along lines of class and religion. In time, national foods would be deployed in new political projects, perhaps most importantly, in the projects of colonialism and imperialism. That's where we go. In time, national foods would be deployed in new political projects, perhaps most importantly, in the projects of colonialism and imperialism. That's where we'll go when we pick things up next. But let's leave it there for now. Thanks for joining me today. See you all next time.